Russia, a vast, cold, and mysterious country, has witnessed centuries of history filled with both light and darkness. Among its most sinister and fascinating rulers stands Ivan IV Vasilievich, better known as Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar in the country's history. His name is no coincidence. Terrible in this context refers not only to his cruelty, but also to his imposing, almost divine authority, which inspired reverential fear. Yet behind that facade of absolute power was a deeply insecure, paranoid man obsessed with control. Born in 1530, Ivan ascended to the throne at just 16 years old in 1547, when he crowned himself not as Grand Prince, but as Tsar, a title derived from the Latin Caesar, thereby linking his lineage to the ancient Roman Empire and granting himself imperial legitimacy. This act was not merely symbolic. It marked the beginning of a new era for Russia, transforming it from a conglomerate of feudal principalities into a centralized monarchy under a single ruler. But that leadership came hand in hand with a psychological storm that would affect both his people and his own family. From a young age, Ivan suffered profound traumas. His father died when he was only 3 years old, and during his childhood he was mistreated by the boyar families, the Russian aristocracy, who used him as a political pawn while they vied for power. Those years of humiliation and neglect forged a wounded soul, filled with resentment toward the nobility and a desperate need to assert absolute dominance. In the early years of his reign, Ivan showed signs of being a brilliant reformer. He created Russia's first postal system, reorganized the military, and promoted territorial expansion. He also established a written legal code, something revolutionary for the time. However, after the death of his first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, in 1560, everything changed. Many historians believe Anastasia was poisoned by rival boyars, although this was never proven. From that moment on, Ivan fell into a spiral of unprecedented paranoia and violence. To control the corrupt nobility and maintain order, Ivan created a special group of loyal servants known as the Oprichnina, dressed in black cloaks and riding black horses, symbols of the terror they spread wherever they went. This force operated outside the traditional judicial system and acted as the Tsar's personal secret police. Their methods were brutal: summary executions, land confiscations, torture, and yes, in some cases, even boiling enemies alive in hot oil. This kind of extreme punishment was not exclusive to Ivan, but it became characteristic of his regime. It is said he used this technique to eliminate those he considered traitors or heretics, especially within the Russian Orthodox Church. The process involved submerging the live victim in large cauldrons filled with boiling oil or animal fat. Death was slow, agonizing, and exemplary, a message to anyone who might even think of defying his authority. But Ivan's violence was not limited to his political enemies. His wrath fell mercilessly upon his own circle, including his family. In an act etched in Russian history and art, such as in the famous painting Ivan the Terrible and His Son Ivan by Ilya Repin, the Tsar accidentally killed his son and heir with a blow from his staff during a heated argument in 1581. Ivan had accused his son of conspiring against him and of being involved in a forbidden relationship with his daughter-in-law. Regret came too late. Ivan the Terrible's life ended in 1584, amid suspicions of poisoning, although the official cause was a stroke. His legacy is complex. On one hand, he consolidated the power of the Russian state and laid the foundations of the future empire. On the other, he left behind a climate of terror, fear, and mistrust that would shape the country's internal politics for decades. But what drove Ivan to commit such atrocities? Was it madness, paranoia, accumulated trauma, or simply the thirst for absolute power? That question takes us deeper into the mind of a man who lived between genius and insanity. To understand the dark heart of Ivan the Terrible, one must enter his mind, a labyrinth of fear, obsession, and an insatiable thirst for control. But it was not just his psyche that shaped his bloody reign. It was also the historical context, the Russian culture of the time, and the external influences surrounding the young Tsar. 16th century Russia was a crucible of Orthodox traditions, Mongol influences, and political ambition. Ivan grew up in an environment where violence and betrayal were commonplace. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, served as regent until her death when Ivan was only 8 years old. Many believe she was poisoned. After her disappearance, the boyars took control, leaving Ivan practically abandoned. This emotional and political void sowed in him a deep distrust of the nobility, which would later become one of the driving forces behind his murderous fury. But it wasn't only aristocratic betrayal that shaped Ivan. There was also his religious vision of power. For him, being Tsar was not just a political title, but a divine mission. He saw himself as the defender of the Russian Orthodox Church, chosen by God to uphold the kingdom's moral and spiritual order. This messianic idea gave him carte blanche to justify any act of violence as necessary to protect the faith and the state. In fact, Ivan did not hesitate to punish corrupt clerics or heretics with death. And many of these executions involved horrific methods such as the aforementioned boiling in oil. The church played a double role in his life. On one hand, it was a source of stability and spiritual guidance. On the other, it was a constant battleground between ecclesiastical and royal power. Ivan even clashed directly with influential religious figures, especially when they questioned his decisions or criticized the massacres carried out by the Oprichnina. Some bishops were executed, others imprisoned, and some simply disappeared. But why resort to such extreme methods? The answer seems to lie in his pathological paranoia. Ivan constantly lived under the threat of conspiracies. Every glance, every whispered conversation, every movement by a noble could be interpreted as a sign of treason. In his mind, he was not only ruling Russia, he was fighting a constant war against dark forces determined to destroy him. This mentality led him to create the feared Oprichnina, a special corps of loyal servants that acted like a kind of Praetorian guard with absolute power. The Oprichniki not only hunted down traitors, they also instilled terror throughout the population. They marched in sinister processions wearing black cloaks, riding black horses, and carrying skulls along with a broom and a sponge, symbols that represented sweeping Russia, clean of enemies, and absorbing their possessions. Their actions had no legal or moral limits. They could break into homes, arrest people without trial, confiscate land, and even kill. And yes, in some cases, they used grotesque methods like boiling in oil as a form of public execution and deterrence. This type of torture wasn't exclusive to Russia, but in Ivan's hands it reached levels of brutal symbolism. Boiling oil was seen as a perverse method of purification. The guilty would literally burn in an earthly hell. It was a way to show who ruled, who judged, and who decided life or death. But behind this facade of cruelty was a deeply lonely man. Ivan wrote personal letters that reveal a vulnerable side, full of doubts about his destiny and his relationship with God. In them, he expressed feelings of abandonment, of a constant struggle against invisible forces, and pain over the loss of loved ones. He even voluntarily exiled himself from Moscow in 1579, threatening to abdicate after a dispute with the church, an act that paralyzed the entire country. His marriage to Anastasia Romanovna was perhaps the only emotional refuge he ever had. Intelligent and charismatic, she had a moderating influence on Ivan. Her conveniently timed death was the trigger for his final descent into madness. Without her, nothing restrained him. The purges intensified, the Oprichnina became even more ruthless, and fear gripped every corner of the kingdom. But was Ivan truly an uncontrollable madman, or rather a Machiavellian genius who used terror as a political tool? That question leads us to explore how the Tsar managed to expand Russian territory while plunging the country into a climate of constant fear. Despite the internal chaos and the terror he sowed among his own people, Ivan the Terrible didn't just consolidate the power of the Russian state. He also expanded it dramatically. Under his reign, Russia ceased being a regional power and became an empire with continental ambitions. But this expansion wasn't due to chance or diplomatic alliances. It was largely the result of brutal military campaigns, relentless strategies, and an imperial vision that put Russia on the map as a force to be reckoned with. One of Ivan's most significant achievements was the conquest of the Khanate of Kazan in 1552, a Muslim territory in the Volga region that had long been a point of conflict between the Russians and the Tatars. The capture of Kazan wasn't just a major military victory, it was also symbolic. It marked the end of Mongol-Tatar influence over Russia, which had weighed on the Russian elite for centuries. Ivan personally led the siege, using advanced artillery and modern warfare tactics to break the city's defenses. What followed was a massacre. Thousands of Tatars were executed, others sold into slavery, and the rest expelled or assimilated. This event wasn't unique. Shortly after, in 1556, Ivan conquered the Khanate of Astrakhan, another Tatar enclave strategically located near the Caspian Sea. With these two victories, he controlled the entire Volga River basin, secured vital trade routes, and established a natural border that greatly strengthened the kingdom. These triumphs also allowed Russian migration into new lands, laying the foundation for future expansion into Siberia. But if there was one front where Ivan's imperial ambition was clearest, it was in the Baltic region, his great northern garden. The Tsar wanted access to the sea, and for that, he needed to dominate cities like Narva, Polotsk, and especially Riga, a key hub for European trade. To achieve this, he launched a long and exhausting war against a coalition formed by Lithuania, Poland, Sweden, and Denmark. The Livonian War, 1558 to 1583. The campaign began with swift victories. Russian forces captured key fortresses, and it seemed Ivan was close to realizing his maritime dream. However, things soon turned. The Western allies resisted with better military organization and financial support. Ivan also made major strategic mistakes, such as alienating potential local allies and applying scorched earth tactics that ended up hurting his own supplies. The war dragged on for decades, drained resources, and ultimately ended without Russia gaining direct access to the Baltic Sea. Meanwhile, in the east, Ivan authorized a new form of expansion: the exploration and colonization of Siberia. Although he didn't live to see it completed, his support of figures like the Stroganov brothers and the Cossack mercenary Yermak Timofeyevich laid the groundwork for Siberia's eventual conquest. Yermak led an armed expedition that defeated the Khanate of Sibir in 1581, opening the way for the gradual annexation of vast Asian territories. But this expansion came at a massive human cost. As in Kazan, native populations were systematically subdued, enslaved, or exterminated. Resistance was crushed with extreme violence. On several occasions, Ivan ordered mass killings as a warning: whoever resists will die. This policy of fear was effective, but also bred resentment that would eventually erupt. Ivan didn't just expand the empire geographically, he also transformed its internal structure. He created a more centralized administration, reduced the local power of the boyars, and established a professional army based on mandatory service from the lesser nobility, known as the Dvorian. This was a crucial change. It gave the Khazar a loyal and efficient army, free from the traditional aristocracy's personal ambitions. However, behind every military victory and territorial gain lurked a constant: fear. Fear of losing control, fear of betrayal, fear that his entire legacy could be destroyed by those within his own walls. That fear led him to commit terrible acts, even against his own family. His paranoia didn't stop with nobles or the clergy. It extended to those closest to him, even his own children. If there is one chapter in Ivan the Terrible's life that remains etched in the Russian collective memory, it is undoubtedly the death of his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, in 1581. This tragic event was not only a family catastrophe, but a symbolic moment of the Tsar's mental state. A man so consumed by fear, jealousy, and paranoia that he ended up killing, with his own hands, the one who was meant to succeed him. Everything began during a violent argument between father and son. The young Ivan, 27 years old, was known for his moderate temperament, his interest in diplomacy, and his concern for the welfare of the people, a stance that radically distanced him from his father's repressive policies. That night, according to testimonies from the time and later historical accounts, the conflict broke out when the Tsar accused his son of being involved in a forbidden relationship with his daughter-in-law, Maria Nagaya, who would later become Ivan's official wife after the death of his son. However, other versions claim that the argument centered on the brutal treatment of peasants under the terror regime of the Oprichnina. Whatever the exact trigger was, the confrontation quickly escalated. Ivan, in one of his characteristic fits of rage, raised his staff, tipped with a sharp iron point, and struck his son on the head. The injury was fatal. Ivan collapsed to the ground, covered in blood, while his father, gripped by panic and regret, tried to stop the bleeding with his own hands. But it was all in vain. The heir died a few hours later. This moment would be forever etched in Russian history, thanks to the famous painting Ivan the Terrible and His Son Ivan by Ilya Repin, painted in 1885. It shows the terrified and devastated face of Ivan the Terrible holding his dying son, bloodstains on his shirt, and a look of horror in his eyes. The painting caused such a stir that it was physically attacked multiple times by Russian protesters, even being slashed with a knife in 2018, requiring several restorations. But this tragedy was not an isolated incident. Ivan had previously lost another son, Dmitry, his youngest, born to his third wife, Maria Nagaya. Dmitry was only 8 years old when he died in 1591 under suspicious circumstances in the city of Uglich. Official versions claimed he accidentally killed himself while playing with a knife, but many believed he was assassinated on Ivan's orders or by one of his men. The child's death sparked popular unrest in Uglich, where citizens blamed the Tsar. The incident became known as the Uglich Mystery and laid the groundwork for one of the greatest dynastic crises in Russian history, the so-called Time of Troubles. With the deaths of his two male heirs, Ivan the Terrible left a succession void that would shape the empire's destiny. When he died in 1584, the throne passed to his surviving son, Fyodor I, a weak and sickly man with no political skill. During his reign, real power fell into the hands of his father-in-law, Boris Godunov, the seed of a decade of political chaos that would lead to false czars, foreign invasions, and historic famines. But let us return to the dark heart of Ivan himself. How could a man who considered himself chosen by God, protector of the Orthodox faith, and absolute ruler, commit such acts of violence against his own blood? Many historians have speculated on possible mental disorders, such as paranoid disorder, schizophrenia, epilepsy, or even advanced syphilis. Others argue that it was the accumulated trauma of his childhood, the utter loneliness of power, and his obsessive need to control every aspect of his environment. What is clear is that Ivan lived in a constant state of alert. He trusted no one, not even his family. He saw betrayal around every corner, conspiracies in every conversation. For him, ruling was a perpetual war, and in that war, even the closest ones could become mortal enemies. And although his legacy is synonymous with cruelty, there are those who see him as a deeply tragic figure, a visionary reformer who, consumed by his inner demons, ended up destroying everything he loved, including his own future. What then remains of Ivan the Terrible? A larger kingdom, yes, a more centralized monarchy, but also a country marked by fear, distrust, and a fractured royal lineage. Ivan the Terrible's legacy is as vast as it is contradictory. He was a brilliant reformer who modernized the Russian state, but also a bloodthirsty ruler who plunged his country into an era of terror. He was a deeply religious man who ordered the execution of clergymen, an imperial visionary who expanded Russia's borders, but also a father who killed his own son with his bare hands. In short, Ivan IV was a Tsar who built an empire on blood, iron, and fear. But beyond dramatic accounts and haunting paintings, what did Ivan the Terrible truly leave behind for Russian history? To answer that question, we must understand how he transformed not only the country's political structure, but also its culture, collective mentality, and relationship with absolute power. One of the most profound changes he introduced was the centralization of power. Before even, Russia was a patchwork of semi-independent principalities where the boyars, the aristocracy, wielded significant control over their territories. Ivan, wounded by the abuse he suffered in childhood at the hands of these very elites, decided to break from that feudal model. Through the creation of the Oprichnina, he established a parallel system of government in which only those loyal to the Tsar held real power. This measure not only eliminated many corrupt nobles, but also laid the foundations of an authoritarian state where power flowed solely from the throne. This centralization allowed Russia to become a more cohesive state, capable of resisting external invasions and projecting itself into new regions. However, it also sowed the seed of a political culture based on reverential fear of the supreme leader, something that would persist for centuries, even under later Tsars and, in some ways, under the Soviet regime. Another of his major achievements was military reform. Ivan understood that to defend and expand his empire, he needed a professional and efficient army. He gradually replaced traditional feudal forces, where each noble contributed soldiers based on their wealth, with a state army made up of dvorian, a lower nobility that served the Tsar directly. He also modernized artillery, incorporating techniques learned from foreign experts and improving domestic arms production. These military reforms were fundamental to the victories in Kazan and Astrakhan, and also laid the groundwork for future campaigns in Siberia. But they came at a huge human cost. Thousands of civilians died in these conflicts, and many communities were annihilated or subjected to forced labor. Ivan also carried out unprecedented administrative and legal reform. In 1550, he issued the Sudebnik, a legal code that unified laws across the kingdom, reducing the arbitrariness of local judges and establishing a more consistent judicial system. The document also included measures to protect peasants from the abuses of feudal lords, although over time, this same Tsar would contribute to binding them even more tightly to the system of serfdom. He also promoted the expansion of education and Orthodox culture, sponsoring the printing of religious books and encouraging the development of monastic schools. He created the first Russian postal system, which facilitated communication between different regions of the empire and strengthened central administration. Additionally, he supported the construction of churches and religious monuments, including the famous St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow's Red Square, built to commemorate the conquest of Kazan. But behind every reform lurked a dark shadow. The Oprichnina was not just a tool of political control. It was a machine of repression that spread terror throughout the population. Thousands of people were tortured, executed, or disappeared without trial. The purges affected both nobles and peasants, and no one was safe from the suspicion of treason. Fear became the currency of the time, and loyalty to the Tsar was the only guarantee of survival. This climate of terror did not only affect Russian society at the time, it left a lasting cultural imprint. For centuries, the Russian people would associate power with fear, and the figure of a strong, almost divine leader would become a recurring archetype in the nation's history. Ivan didn't invent authoritarianism, but he institutionalized it in a brutal and effective way. His death in 1584 did not end the chaos he had created. With no strong and clear heir after the deaths of his sons, Russia entered a period of crisis known as the Time of Troubles, marked by usurpers, false czars, famines, and foreign intervention. It was a cruel reminder that while Ivan the Terrible had built an empire, he had also left it in an extremely fragile position. On the next page, we will explore how Ivan's image has been reinterpreted over the centuries, from a dark villain to an ambiguous symbol of Russian identity. The figure of Ivan the Terrible left a mark not only on Russia's political and social history, but also on its cultural imagination. Over the centuries, his name has been reinterpreted, mythologized, and used as a mirror to reflect the country's inner tensions. In every era, Ivan has been portrayed differently, as a cruel tyrant, a visionary patriot, a bloodthirsty madman, or a tragic leader who sacrificed his humanity for the sake of the state. One of the first serious attempts to analyze Ivan beyond official narratives came in the 19th century, when Russian writers and thinkers began debating national identity. For some, like conservative historian Nikolai Karamzin, Ivan was a necessarily harsh Tsar who faced turbulent times with a firm hand. Others, like Alexander Herzen, a critic of absolutism, saw him as a symbol of Russian despotism that hindered the country's progress toward more liberal models. But it was in painting that Ivan took on his most dramatic dimension. The painting Ivan the Terrible and His Son, Ivan by Ilya Repin, mentioned earlier, became an iconic image of the conflict between power and fatherhood, between violence and remorse. Painted in 1885, the canvas not only captured the horror of Ivan's act, but also symbolized something deeper: the toxic relationship between the state and its people. Many interpreted the Tsar as a metaphor for an oppressive system that ends up destroying its own children. In cinema, Ivan has also had a significant presence. The most famous work is the two-part film Ivan the Terrible, directed by Sergei Eisenstein between 1944 and 1958. Stalin personally commissioned the film, seeing in Ivan a parallel to his own vision of authoritarian leadership. Eisenstein portrayed Ivan as a visionary leader constantly facing conspiracies as he tried to build a strong Russia. However, the project was censored and never officially completed, as Stalin feared that certain scenes could be interpreted as criticism of the Soviet regime. This ambiguity in the perception of Ivan continues to this day. In contemporary Russia, some view him as a forerunner of strong order, even justifying his cruelty as necessary to maintain national unity. Some nationalist groups have even idealized him as a defender of orthodoxy and Russian identity against foreign influences. On the other hand, independent historians and Western media mostly portray him as a brutal ruler, whose legacy includes thousands of deaths and a collective trauma that still affects Russian society. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of Ivan's historical memory is how it has influenced the Russian collective psyche. His figure embodies that eternal internal debate about power. Should it be exercised with harshness and absolute control, or should it be open to participation and dialogue? This tension between authoritarianism and reform has defined much of the country's political history, from later czars to the Soviet era and the current government of Vladimir Putin. Moreover, Ivan has become a recurring character in Russian fantasy and horror literature. Writers like Vladimir Sorokin and Boris Akunin have reimagined him in surreal, dystopian, or even comic contexts, showing how his shadow still looms large in popular culture. Even in video games, animated series, and graphic novels, Ivan appears as a mythical, almost demonic figure who embodies both the genius and the madness of the Russian soul. This process of reinterpretation does not stop. Each new generation seems to need to rethink Ivan, not just as a historical character, but as a mirror of their own anxieties, traumas, and political aspirations. It is a reminder that the past is not dead or buried. It lives on in institutions, in the language of power, and in the stories we tell about ourselves. But behind all these cultural and symbolic layers, one fundamental question remains. Who was Ivan, really? A sick tyrant, a tragic leader, or simply a man broken by the weight of a crown that burned? At the end of the road, Ivan the Terrible remains an enigma, a man who ruled with sword and cross, who loved and destroyed, who modernized Russia while plunging it into terror. His life was a constant battle, against the boyars, against his enemies, against his own mind, and ultimately, against his own son. He was not just a tyrant, nor just a reformer. He was both at once. A Tsar who firmly believed in his divine mission, but who acted as an executioner. A leader who sought unity, but sowed fear. A father who killed out of jealousy. A man who craved absolute control, but never managed to master his inner demons. His legacy is as vast as it is dark. The centralization of power, territorial expansion, and military and administrative reforms make him one of the architects of the modern Russian state. But he also left deep scars, institutionalized fear, mistrust of power, and a culture of silence in the face of oppression. Ivan not only changed Russia's political history, he altered its collective psyche. His shadow stretches beyond history books. It lives in every debate about authoritarianism, in every national identity crisis, in every cultural portrayal that reinterprets his figure. He is both a monster and a symbol, a myth that refuses to die. And although we know more today about his life, his actions, and his motivations, something remains elusive. Truly understanding what went through his mind when he ordered enemies to be boiled alive, when he struck his son, or when he wandered alone through the halls of the Kremlin, surrounded by shadows only he could see. Because Ivan the Terrible was not just a man, he was a storm made flesh,